Hello, how are y'all? Things going okay? All right. Glad to see you. Good. Glad to see y'all. Let's uh let's move forward with talking about Congress and the president and um, those very key and important concepts that you need to be aware of. It's a little dark in here. Let's see if I can't get some light going. There we go. So, Congress was the intended focal point of government. It um, it gets overshadowed today with the presidency because it's easier to cover the president. It's easier to for news media to focus on the president, a single individual that has a press secretary that holds a press conference every day where she articulates the president's policies, views, responses, that kind of thing. And so the president, because he spoon feeds information to the media, they cover what goes on in the White House daily. They don't do that for Congress. There's not someone to be a spokesperson for Congress because in the House, what you have are 435 members all speaking at the same time, all articulating their message individually. And so it's really difficult to get a singular voice from Congress. They don't usually unanimously approve of anything. Uh, Twice, with a declaration of war, you had almost a unanimous declaration, a unanimous voice, rather. But even then, you had a single member of the House dissent. And she said that it was important in times of war to be cautious and not to rush into things and to remind people that there were reasons not to enter into World War One. And she was a member of Congress through World War II. And again in World War II on December 8th of 1941, voted for a declaration of war against Japan. Then Germany declared war on the United States, and we in turn declared war on Germany. And the important thing for you to recognize about that is I know that you have been watching the news and that you have been uh, uh, worried, concerned about Ukraine and the horrible situation that they find themselves in. And it's awful. And I feel every time I watch it, and I'm sure that this is how other people feel, that there is a sense of helplessness about what to do with uh, the situation with Ukraine. Why doesn't the United States just roll them right on in and clean up the big mess just in time for the end of the 2 hour movie? Um, because we're not in a movie and because we have treaty obligations and you do not violate those treaty obligations. The situation is that we are in a collective security agreement with NATO. And y'all know what NATO stands for, right? I think it's so funny. The British write capital N, little a, T, O. No, the American press has got it right, and American history books have it right. It's capital N, capital A, capital T, capital O. That stands for NATO, and NATO is a collective security agreement. NATO means North Atlantic Treaty Organization, and it was formed in response to tensions with the former Soviet Union. And the Soviet Union had an organization called the Warsaw Pact. And that ought to tell you something right there. Poland was an Eastern Bloc country, it was within the Soviet sphere of influence. And the treaty that created the Warsaw Pact was signed where? Warsaw. That's located in Poland. I'm kind of amused at news these days because you'll have people say, on the CG, they always tell you where they are, and up here in the corner it says, Paris, and I guess they think that most Americans are bad at geography because they'll say Paris, France, Warsaw, Poland. Yeah, folks, that's where they are. So some cities you don't have to put what country. We're not talking about Waco here. You don't have to put the country after Paris. You don't have to put the country after New York. Yes, and New York's in our news today. The media lately has only been able to kind of chew gum. They haven't been able to chew gum and walk, and they focus singularly on an event rather than recognizing that, folks, things are happening all over the world. And a lot of things happened when the war with Ukraine broke out. And we're not doing a very good job of knowing what else is going on in the world. But since we've had this conflict between Russia and Ukraine, we have to talk about this. Ukraine used to be part of the Soviet empire, if you will. There were republics, 16 republics that were connected to the former Soviet Union, and Ukraine was one of those. And it gave the appearance that these places were sovereign nations that elected to attach themselves to Russia, but that's not really true. Those Eastern European countries, like Poland, like Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia. Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia were part of the Soviet republics that were attached to the Soviet Union. But Poland was in Eastern Europe, East Germany, Czechoslovakia, Romania, Hungary. Those countries were independent countries, but they were within the Soviet sphere of influence. The same way, much to the chagrin of Canada, they're in our sphere of influence, and we rarely disagree with Canada about anything. And there you have Mexico, and we are in Mexico's sphere of influence, being connected through North America, Central America, South America. Those countries are all influenced by the United States. But this influence with the Soviet Union is a bit different. Those Eastern European countries, even if they were independent, were not going to engage in policies that were offensive to the former Soviet Union, period. They had Soviet troops on their borders, and Soviet troops could invade at the drop of the proverbial hat. Of course, there were American troops lined up in Western European countries, and folks, we're still there. We're still in Germany. We're still in Western European countries with military bases. If you stood in Moscow, and I think it's important for you that I give you some insight about the way the Russians are looking at this, because you're not going to get much of that unless they give you a Russian expert on the news to talk about this sort of thing, and they are precious and few. There aren't many. If you stand in Moscow and you look out at the world, you are completely surrounded by American military installations, by people who have a relationship with the United States. And this is a big news that Finland and Sweden, and a very good friend of mine used to be the ambassador to Sweden from the United States, and he and I talk about this once a week at least. He'll give me a call. And my husband ran his campaign for Congress. We're very close friends. And when you recognize that the Soviets, the Russians, it's hard to break a habit and refer to them as just the Russians. When you look at Russian history, it is a history of Western invasion. They have been invaded repeatedly by other countries. And frankly, kids, they ain't going to let the United States set foot on their soil. That's not going to happen. We are not going to go into Ukraine. And I know Ukraine is an independent country now, but the Russians don't consider it so. And that's their attitude. This business of being surrounded by hostile forces is the whole reason that they had the Warsaw Pact, and that Mr. Putin would like to return to the good old days. They weren't that great, where you have a buffer zone between NATO and Russia. And he would like to bring back the glory that was the former Soviet Union. And he'll do it by force. And do I think that he'll stop with Ukraine? Of course not. And he's not going to stop. If Moldavia or Georgia aren't his next stop. And I'm very curious about what he intends to do about South Central Asia. I have been within about 250 miles of the Afghan border there. And that country, the best way I can illustrate this to you is that those South Central Asian countries where religion is still tremendously important, they went on about their affairs, they went on about their business, and couldn't have cared less about Soviet designs on them. It didn't stop prayer 5 times a day. It did not foster any kind of modernization of life there. And what's happened in those regions has been the wealth of oil and gas, and those industries have driven modernization in those areas, because that's what capitalism does. And so what's happened in Russia is a real lack of this growth of a middle class. And let me say this about that in the American presidency. The point of a successful presidency, what successful presidencies we've had, is because their administrations worked solidly and dramatically to cushion and insulate the middle class, and to give the middle class programs that could foster economic growth and healthy economies for the middle class. Because really, y'all, the only thing that lifts people out of poverty, that changes an individual's social status in this country, is a good education, which gives you a better job than your dad had, hopefully, and gives you something to look forward to in terms of economic prosperity. Without that, without bolstering the middle class, you got zip. And that's what's happened in Russia over the last 20 years. You did not have American investment, because one of my oil friends said, well, we can't invest there until things straighten up and things are secure. And I said, it's not going to get that way until you do invest. And what happened? You've got Chanel. They've got a boutique in Moscow. Who cares if you can't buy those goods? Who buys those goods? People who are associated with Russian oligarchs, but not middle class Russians, because there is no middle class Russia. And they're angry. And they've started noticing, because of this thing called the internet, that people live better lives than they do. And when Mr. Putin was a KGB officer and stationed in East Germany, he could see that people in West Germany of equal status, military and intelligence agents, lived far better lives than KGB folks. And KGB folks in East Germany lived better lives than KGB folks in Moscow. What that does is create resentment and anger and bitterness. And I think you could use those 3 words to describe Mr. Putin really well. And he wants to do something major, something magnificent, on the scale of Khrushchev and Kennedy over Cuba, on the scale of Stalin in terms of ripping the Soviet Union into the 20th century. There was no industrial revolution there. There was no moment where there was private entrepreneurship. There was no moment outside of collective farming. Folks, when Mr. Gorbachev came here and flew in aircraft over the United States and saw houses and neighborhoods having to explain to him, oh, with swimming pools in the backyard. I always think that's neat when you're flying, you can see the pools. He was just dumbfounded by this. How do you have this kind of wealth in this country? And Reagan had to explain through private initiative, through privately owned property, they didn't have such a thing. They didn't know what a mortgage was. They didn't know how to use that mortgage, and how mortgages, how you save and have 10% down or 20% down for a house, and then you get a mortgage from a bank and you pay. That was mind-boggling to them. They had no idea. And they had no real way of taking the investment capital, which was non-existent, and creating that kind of middle class. It just didn't happen. And folks, when you have people making, a couple of hundred rubles a month, and those rubles are practically worthless because it's a closed economy, people use the dollar all over the world. The United States says we guarantee that dollar because that's who we are. I mean, it's all because we believe that it's a wish that can come true. It's all the use of creative capital, the use of imagination. And that's because we grow up understanding. Some people have an intuitive understanding of that. They're just around it and they absorb it. Nothing like that had ever happened to the Russians. And so they weren't really able to create wealth to purchase private companies or to get investors to come and say, look, I'll put up 20%, you guys put up the 80%, we'll deal with it as we go. Nothing like that. A stock market that never has a good day. Nobody wants to buy anything in Russia. There isn't anything to buy. And there isn't anything. I mean, when I was there in 1983, walking around with an American Express card, which was used in party stores by members of the party, could have those kinds of things and could shop in better stores than other people had. I walked around with a whole lot of money and I didn't want to buy anything. It's like the worst garage sale you'd ever been to. The worst junk store. It was like going to Canton and not finding anything you wanted. But everything's out of date. Everything looks shop worn. You stand in line for hours I'll just never forget. It was in Moscow, and people were beating the hell out of each other on the street. And I asked a fellow Shtata, what is this? What's happening? And he explained to me that these people were fighting in line for bread. That's a very awkward and difficult situation to teach people who aren't eating properly on a regular basis, that if they will just work harder, their dreams will come true. The whole thing was like, y'all know what a Potemkin village is? A Potemkin village, he was a advisor to Catherine the Great. And she wanted to tour where peasants lived. And their housing was so shameful and sad and depressing that Potemkin ordered beautiful housing built like a set on a movie theater. It was just the facade of a beautiful place. And you go inside and there's nothing. It's just a set. And she drove by that, and he paid people to bathe and put on good clothes, and gave them clothes to wear and stood them out there, and they waved like happy people, which they were not. And so you're talking about a society that has, in some respects, the world has passed them by. And what Putin wants to do in his nouveau capitalist way of looking at the world. Um, he wants to bring that kind of opportunity to people, but he doesn't know where to begin. He does know that if he doesn't keep these oligarchs financed, that he can't stay in power. They're the reason that he's in power. And these are people, former KGB thug types, that and essentially what you've got is a mafioso kind of society and culture, and these guys are just mafia. It's a Russian mafia that's very, very different than the traditional mafia. Brutal, brutal in how they handle things. Plus, you had a lot of Russian brain trust. A lot of people with know-how and intelligence leave as soon as they could get out because it's unbearable. It's awful. And what's happening with Putin now is he's locking up people who disagree with him. And you've got neighbors ratting on neighbors. You've got children telling on their teachers that their teachers don't support the war. And that's 15 years in prison if you call it a war instead of an insurrection. What I think is going to start happening there is there's nothing more dangerous than a bad government trying to reform. I think what's going to happen there is the whole place is going to come unraveled with this tissue of lies. And you're going to see hundreds of thousands of people just walk out of there, just leave. They're already leaving. What you've got is a totalitarian society in its earliest stages. When people are telling on their neighbors over their politics, you have very little hope for an open, capitalistic, and small d democratic society. Those concepts are alien. And what you got there is, once again, the Russians have gotten themselves a strong man, and there's something about the Russian soul that likes that strong man, and they keep repeating the same mistakes again and again because they're unable to make the leap into self-government and supporting a middle class. It must support a middle class. Every president that we can rattle off in the last 80 years has done economic programs and government spending that support middle class ideals, hopes, ambitions. And if they don't do that, they don't get reelected. It's that simple. You must do it or you won't get reelected. And that bread and butter issue is really what gets presidents elected. It's how we measure their success. Putin has done nothing in terms of grand programs or even grand challenges to the West. Khrushchev pushed that envelope, and he had people in the Kremlin who were more conservative than Khrushchev. And so he was trying to walk that tightrope between democratic reform and Stalinism. And what Mr. Putin would like to go back to, ironically, is Stalinism. Stalin's his hero. And you'd be hard pressed outside of Nazi Germany to find anybody worse than Joseph Stalin. But the trains ran on time. Oh, there was order, 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 order. And there wasn't any of that messy democratic thinking, you know. And people were brutally murdered for having the wrong idea about how to farm, for heaven's sakes. Ukraine is the breadbasket. That's where all the wheat production is. And there's not going to be any wheat production this year in Russia. And that's going to drive wheat prices all over the world really up as Russians try to buy up wheat with nothing. Their ruble is worthless now that he's accomplished that. And any investors in the future just left. American companies have left, except for people like the Koch brothers. Nestle's still there. You can get a Kit Kat bar. It's really depressing. McDonald's finally closed, and Coca-Cola left. Pepsi had a deal with the Russians for many years. When I was there, I could get Pepsi, but I couldn't get Coke, and the Pepsi was just awful because it was bottled there. And that was part of the agreement. Pepsi had to give their formula to the Russians. Coca-Cola said, hell no, and wouldn't do that. And so Pepsi was available in exchange for some Russian vodka. And most vodka is not even made in Russia anymore. But it's still tractor fuel. Whatever it is, dress it up however you want. It's all ethanol, and I don't care how much it costs. It's all ethanol, and that's all that matters. And one drink, no kidding. I mean, I know this sounds extreme, and I know it sounds like some kind of reefer madness thing I'm telling you, but it's true. Even moderate drinking can cause brain damage and harmful memory loss. It is not a good drug, and we can talk till the cows come home about how. I mean, the hieroglyphics on the pyramids teach you how to make alcohol. As long as there have been people and unhappy people, they've been trying to figure out how to get high. At any rate, Pepsi's even left. Pepsi said, "We're out of here too," because it's going to hurt their sales at home. It's un-American to be. It's un-Ukrainian. I mean, I think it's amazing how patriotism shifts to democratic conflict. And it's funny. The Ukrainians don't see the little Ukrainian flags that people are wearing, but people are really fired up about this and how helpful it would be. Folks, it's good to give charity wise, and these people are going to be relocating, and they're going to be relocating with merely what they could carry in 2 suitcases. And it's tremendously important to help people where help is needed. It's fascinating to me that people will complain about immigrants from south of the border, but they get fired up about Ukrainian immigrants flooding in. So it's an interesting dilemma all the way around, but we're not getting involved in that war. I think they're pushing the envelope here. They're really, really running a risk of providing defensive weapons or offensive weapons. And it depends on what side of a gun you're on as to if something is offensive or defensive. Madeleine Albright, who died recently, and I must have missed her state funeral. I didn't see any scheduling for a state funeral for Albright. No coverage of that. Coverage of a war, yes, and carnage and dead bodies on television. But Madeleine Albright's death didn't get the attention that her male counterpart, Colin Powell, got. Albright used to tell Powell, "You tell me all the time we've got this wonderful army. Why don't you use it?" Albright and President Clinton initiated a foreign policy and relationship with NATO, that NATO is not merely a way of defending people against the Soviet Union. NATO is a very important influence for democratic thought and democratic ideals throughout the areas where it does have influence. Albright, a victim of both brands of totalitarianism. She had to deal with fascist Hitler and had to deal with the Soviet Union as well, Stalinism, and then later, Khrushchev, Khrushchev is very different than Stalin. But my point is this: her concept of freedom was threatened by both styles of totalitarianism, which smell remarkably the same. But fascism is not anywhere the same thing as communism. They are two different ideologies, but how they're implemented can look remarkably similar. Totalitarian, all-encompassing government. She had to deal with that, and so her belief system about how important it was to resist government encroachment, foreign government encroachment into her country. She came here when she was a little girl, and her dad was a professor, and he got a professorship, and later he taught another brilliant little girl. Her name was Condoleezza Rice. So his daughter would become President Clinton's Secretary of State. She was the first woman to hold that position in any government in the United States. And then her dad taught Condoleezza Rice, who was President Bush's Secretary of State. And their attitude toward NATO, and W followed Clinton's initiative with this, that NATO is to be a force for democracy, not merely reactive to the Soviet challenge, but rather active. I don't like that term proactive. It's active and reactive. It's not proactive and active. At any rate, that's your grammar lesson for the day. An active force for democracy. And so when war broke out in Kosovo, we sent troops. It's a lot easier to send troops when you're not going to be facing the Soviet Union. Soviet Union, Russia, has nuclear weapons. And when Putin started this fight with Ukraine, it was over the invitation in 2008 to join NATO. That is profoundly threatening to Russia, to have a NATO country touching its borders. And the thing about Ukraine is this, and I really recommend that you read up on this, it's fascinating. Ukraine during World War II fought both the fascist and the communist. And the beginnings of the Israeli secret defense, intelligence, secret operations group, the Mossad, it has its origins in people who came from Ukraine. Their attitude is, oh, there's a fight, let me get in it. You know, is it a fight for justice? Let me get in it. They're very active with a very strong sense of right and wrong, and a very determined group of people who survived being a launching point for Hitler into the Soviet Union. And they fought both the fascist and the communist. And they were independent for a while after Lenin came to power. And then Stalin reabsorbed them because he considered them threatening because they had fought against communism. And you will remember, or you will be familiar with the idea that what Stalin did to get Ukraine to submit to his will was starve them. They starved millions of people to death in Ukraine. And so there is a bitter hatred and attitude toward Russia. And you can see why. It's just horrible. And Ukraine was not really allowed any ideas or influence that came from the West, even though they had been westward looking in World War II. We cannot get in this conflict other than to provide, the most minor military equipment that is not superior to Soviet equipment. There is no real air war there, although Zelensky wants NATO planes. He's not going to get them. Think about this. If the Russians were able to capture one of those F-15 fighters, which cost about $5 billion each, if he were able to capture, then they've got our planes and they're going to go over them with a fine-tooth comb, and they're going to get the technology that's aboard that F-15 that's superior to the SUs or to the MiGs. And that's not good. And that makes us look really foolish and really stupid. And so we're not going to do that. Now, there's not much of an air war. And frankly, y'all, I'm really surprised that the Russians didn't just bomb the hell out of Ukraine and then send troops in that way. And send, what you do, and what we learned from Hitler was bombing, then a ground war of tanks and personnel pushing, and then a force of people come behind and then occupy. And that kind of blitzkrieg war is not really what we saw. And I was very surprised that Putin didn't take that, shocking, successful, if I can use that term, about something that Hitler's uh, forces developed. But that was the most successful conventional warfare in Europe until the Americans got there. And frankly, the Americans just used their tactics right against the Germans. They overwhelming force, overwhelming air and ground superiority, and they didn't do that in Ukraine, and I didn't understand why that didn't take place. Now they've changed generals, and we may very well see that this week in fighting there, and brutal, horrible fighting. If Russia were to use chemical weapons and used tactical small nuclear weapons to annihilate forces, you might see a European NATO push to go in. But I'll be frank with you, and Putin said this immediately. If the United States were to invade, if the allies, if NATO were to invade, and we are NATO, he'd use nuclear weapons, and is capable of using nuclear weapons in the United States. He is capable of launching the nuclear attack. He has 4,000 nuclear weapons that we know of. Somebody asked me if they were really well maintained and if they were operational, and I said, well, if one of them is operational and it hits New York, then war's on. And a kind of war that we understand the possibilities of, but you might not be very familiar with. I spent elementary school hiding under my desk in the Cold War, and studied Cold War problems throughout my career in college, and gone to the Soviet Union to see their side of the story. And we don't want to get into a nuclear conflict with the former Soviet Union because it's unwinnable. Mutually assured destruction is what's kept us from fighting since the end of World War II. There have been some proxy wars along the way, and this right now is not quite a proxy war, but it wouldn't last to be a proxy war. They will push back with overwhelming force, and we will launch everything we have at them. At least if you don't use it, you lose it. You got to get it out of the ground, or it could possibly be destroyed. And it's hard once they start firing at you to get anything out of the ground because of an electromagnetic pulse, which that's the first element of a nuclear device, is that it renders everything with an electrical charge useless. So you can't start a car. You do understand that it's electricity that starts that car, the spark of the starter. You wouldn't be able to do that, but you wouldn't be able to listen to a radio. That won't work. Internet, gone. Television, gone. Electricity, gone. And then you have hell from the sky that you don't. It'll be hard for you to imagine. The best examples that I can give you of what Hollywood imagines nuclear war to be like. One of the Terminator movies, I want to say it was the second one, there is a scene where the mom, Linda Hamilton, is dreaming of what a nuclear conflict would be like. And her dream is extremely accurate in the depiction. We know from photographs and firsthand accounts of what Hiroshima and Nagasaki were like with the use of one nuclear device. And those devices, the power of that device is the starter for the power of it. What I'm trying to say inartfully to you is the weapons that we have today are 50 to 100 times more powerful than what we used in Nagasaki and Hiroshima. And it would completely level every major city. Every city with more than 25,000 people in it is a Soviet or Russian target. And the same would be said for them. You need to watch a film called The Day After to give you some idea of what life for survivors might be like. And maybe you might survive 2 weeks, but by then all your water and all your food, even canned goods, would be radiated. There's nothing to eat. When the Russians faced a Nazi bombardment of the city of St. Petersburg, then known as Leningrad, during World War II, they held out for 900 days. It's a very famous book by Harrison Salisbury called 900 Days. And in that, Hitler is bombarding St. Petersburg, and there's no food. There's nothing to eat. He's going to starve them out. I know that sounds kind of primitive for that powerful of an army to do, but they're starving them. And the Russians ate each other to survive. They would wait till neighbors died of starvation and they'd go over and get their neighbors and eat them. They ate children. They ground their furniture into sawdust to have something to bake into bread to eat. You're talking about a resourceful, tough, very tough people who put up with a great deal of inconvenience and hard living. And they're really very seasoned and very well equipped for war. But there's an essay by Carl Sagan, the physicist and astronomy scientist from Cornell University. Carl Sagan wrote an essay called Nuclear Winter, and I really recommend it to you as well because he explains the science behind what would happen in a catastrophic nuclear event between the United States and the former Soviet Union. At the time of his writing, it was still the Soviet Union. And Sagan said what would happen would be that these large pieces, they're like, I want you to imagine giant snowflakes, really big pieces of snow. That's radiation. And it would snow down on the northern hemisphere, blocking out the sun, stopping all agriculture. And that means cattle would have nothing to eat. And that means they would be outside exposed to radiation. There'd be no crops. And so starvation is very real. And the northern hemisphere, of course, would come in extinction first, but weather would spread that nuclear cloud to the southern hemisphere, and they would face a nuclear winter, 4 to 6 months after we do, as weather travels their way. So there's no escaping this. You're here stuck on what President Kennedy called this small planet. And his speech at the American University after the Cuban Missile Crisis and what he laid out was an idea that we should seek cooperation between the United States and Russia because we really didn't have any other choice. After World War II, the United States and the Soviet Union were the remaining superpowers. I think you have to be honest about this. The United States would have had a very difficult time defeating Hitler in Europe had the Soviets not spent 50 million Soviet citizens fighting Germany. And we sort of joined the party a little late. There was already intense fighting happening in 1940 in the European theater. In 1938, Hitler had invaded Austria and Czechoslovakia. And, Poland was essentially torn apart between fighting the fascists and fighting the communists. And so what I'm driving at here is President Kennedy said, we've seen what war can do. What would peace be like? And the Cold War was this creative tension between the United States and the Soviet Union, but it was supported by what was known as mutually assured destruction. The creation of NATO was a buffer, and NATO had this defensive posture. And that really changed with Madeleine Albright and President Clinton. It was that democracy should spread, that countries that have democratic ideals don't go to war with each other. Countries that trade with each other don't go to war with each other. And so we needed to be a force for democratic good. And that was threatening to Vladimir Putin. And he does not want NATO countries on his borders. Finland and Sweden want to join NATO. And I have a former student who is in Finland right now. He wants to live and work there. And he texted me the other night. The time zones are different. He texted me and he said, I just saw a report that said that Soviet MiGs have overflown Sweden and Finland. And those MiGs have nuclear missiles attached to them. And that was a warning to Finland and Sweden that to join NATO might mean, and if I was a betting person, I would say if Finland and Sweden join NATO, Russia is going to very possibly attack either one, if not both, of those countries, because they see NATO as aggressive to the idea of Western invasion. Finland used to belong to the Soviet Union, and so they have some entree there. It's a really short train ride between the capital of Finland and St. Petersburg. It's about a 6-hour train ride. So they're pretty close. And they used to be Russian territory and fought for their independence once again against the fascists and the communists in conflict in 1938 and 1939, which ironically put them at war, Finland, at war against our ally, Russia. Russia and the United States were allies in World War II. They were allies in World War I until Russia left the war. And the United States invaded the Soviet Union in 1918 to try to overthrow the Russian government, the new Bolshevik communist government. And so we've been at odds since the Russians' inception, or the communist inception, when the Tsar was killed and was no longer in power. So it's an interesting time to be alive. And it's an interesting time to be in this conflict. But I don't anticipate, now watch me be wrong next week, I don't anticipate that we're going to be engaged in that war. I'll tell you, I saw General Wesley Clark, retired general, and he's one of my favorite folks in terms of military politics. Clark said that this is the war that we're meant to get involved in. And Clark sees this as a conflict not about Ukraine, but a conflict between the United States and the former Soviet Union. And when I heard him say that, I have to admit to you, I was just dumbfounded. I mean, literally, my mouth fell open, because I really firmly believe, and others support this too, that would be a nuclear confrontation, and a confrontation that we just cannot allow. And there's just really no winner in that conflict. So that's kind of where we are with regard to foreign policy. And, Congress's role in all of this is that they fund policy that's established by Congress, but policies that are established by the presidency. It's Congress that gives the president a declaration of war, not the president cannot engage in conflict, a war conflict, without that declaration of war from Congress. And if he deploys troops, he's got to follow the War Powers Act, which was written by Congress to try to rein in Richard Nixon. Nixon vetoed it, and Congress overrode his veto. To try to make the president accountable for sending troops willy-nilly all over the place without a declaration of war. Some presidents regard the War Powers Act as unconstitutional. I happen to think it's unconstitutional myself. The president, as commander-in-chief, makes war. That means he makes war policy. And so when he sends troops wherever he wishes, he has the ability to control those troops, not Congress. But how Congress ended the Vietnam War was to simply stop paying for it. And if you don't have the money to pay for it, you can't send those troops anywhere. Are there questions about this, comments about this? It's a lot to digest. Lots of key terms that you need to know about for possible test questions. So if you have questions, ask now, or we'll talk about that on questions on that on Thursday, or email questions, of course, to me. There's a lot of pressure to get involved in this conflict, and there will be a swift answer to involvement in that conflict. I just don't feel good about giving Vladimir Putin that opportunity. Somebody said, it's interesting. Yeah, it is. It's very interesting. It's scary as hell is what it is. And worrying about the outcome of this conflict, I'm not worried about it. I'm going to get a lawn chair and go out and watch the launch because you can't get out of town. We've proven that with hurricanes. And Houston will be one of the first targets within the top 10 targets that the Russians will nuke first, because this is where the oil's at. This is where the refineries are. This is where space technology is. And we can't have any of that. And so, yeah, this will be, it'll be Washington, D.C., New York, Los Angeles, Chicago, Houston, Dallas. And then your towns with bases are targets too, like Shreveport with Barksdale, that's a nuclear base. Amarillo, there's a place outside of Amarillo called Pantex, and it's the final assembly point and disassembly point for all of our nuclear weapons. It's just a little place outside of Amarillo, and Amarillo used to have an important base, but no longer does. But they will be blown apart, melted because of Pantex and its strategic value. But this, would take about 30 minutes for missiles from Russia to reach their targets in the United States. And then, of course, you have nuclear submarines that are about 12 miles off our coast in international waters. And we have nuclear submarines about 12 miles off of their coast, too. But it will be some pretty spectacular fireworks back and forth, and that's about all there would be. The living will envy the dead. There aren't enough burn beds. There aren't enough hospitals. And that's what will happen is radiation burns. And destruction where your skyscrapers in downtown Houston, they're made out of glass, right? Glass superheated just goes back into sand, which is, the origin. When you heat sand, you have glass. And so all of that will fly through the air, slicing anything around it. The steel girders of those buildings, the steel structural skeletons of those buildings will melt. You won't be able to start your car, much less drive one. It is stopped dead on the highway. And it won't move, and there's really nowhere you can go because the food supply is going to be compromised pretty quickly, and you'll have mass panic and pandemonium. And I really kind of feel for y'all because you didn't grow up in the active part of the Cold War, so stuff that's common knowledge to us y'all are unaware of. Somebody just said it might be a question that would be no, there's no such thing as a bad question, okay? But how effective are the Russian missiles compared to United States missiles? I know the similarity would be radiation. The Russians' missiles are dirtier. They have more radiation than United States missiles. US missiles are more accurate. And so the Russians put more radiation and more boom in their missiles because they know they're not going to hit the target. So I'll put it to you this way: they'll aim at Houston and hit Sugarland, and so they have enough radiation in that bomb to do destruction. They'll have enough firepower in that bomb to go ahead and wipe out Houston too. And plus, they're not going to hit you with one. There'll be many nuclear devices that way. So more blast radius, absolutely. Dirtier, dirtier bombs with more boom, more concussive force. And you understand, y'all, that these weapons don't hit the ground. They explode over the top of the ground so that more radiation is spread and scattered in the atmosphere, and then it rains to the ground. Our missiles are far more accurate, so we can park them wherever we want them. And they don't have as much radiation because they will hit their intended targets. They're much more accurate, fiercely accurate, because we're able to build that kind of communications into the weaponry. We can make them smaller. The Russians have mastered that too. They can make little bombs about the size of a suitcase, as opposed to something the size of a Volkswagen. They're not that big. But suitcase nukes are really small, but they have a radioactive signature to them, and so you can't really conceal them and that kind of thing because radiation would be escaping and would be ticking at any time. American missiles can hit their target anywhere it go, absolutely. And so if we wanted to bomb the Kremlin, if and we hit Moscow, that's not as accurate as if we bomb the Kremlin and hit Putin's office. And we're capable of doing that. Their bombs are not that tactically. They don't have the GPS that we do. They don't have that kind of precision. And so when we talk about nuclear arms limitations, that's a huge sticking point of their bombs are dirtier and less accurate, so they think that they should have more of them. We are pinpoint precision accurate, and so the Russians fear that more. Their missiles are heavier. They have more what we call throw weight because their fuel is solid. Our fuel is liquefied, is much more efficient, fuel efficient, and much more capable in that regard. I can tell you that no one wins this, and the fear that one would be nuts enough to launch one because of the mutually assured destruction. If we got a warning across the DEW line, which is the Defense Early Warning Line that runs across Canada, if that alarm were to sound, we launch on warning. We don't wait around till we have a visual inspection of missiles flying over the top of the earth. If we think they're coming, we're going to get everything out of the ground we can before that electronic burst renders those missiles useless. Because, come on, haven't y'all ever seen that movie War Games? At the first of the movie, there is the procedure for launch is drilled, and the guys who are down in these silos are told to turn their key to launch their weapons. And we figure about 1/3 of our forces won't be able to do it because they don't want to be responsible for what's about to happen. The idea that they will be killing every man, woman, and child in a Russian city. They don't want to do that. And so, that movie's a good indicator of a procedure of how this takes place, if you need a visual to grasp it. But the idea of MAD, mutually assured destruction, is what's kept us from doing it. But when a conflict starts and Vladimir Putin says, and I have nuclear weapons, I can assure you that everyone in military and political intelligence swallowed hard, because that was an implicit, hell, it was obvious to me, so I don't know how implicit that is. It's no secret. It's an overt threat. He is saying, do not interfere with my mission in Ukraine, or I will use nuclear weapons against you. And so that's real sobering. And we would violate NATO if we interfered in this conflict, because what you are inviting then is nuclear weapons all through our NATO allies. People would be destroyed in Western Europe as well. Western Europe becomes a target. They've always been a target. They have been the buffer zone. See, Western Europe is our buffer against the Soviets. They have more people in their military than we do, and when should we get involved, the first thing that's going to happen is they're going to forget about Ukraine, and they're going to roll right across that very flat area of Europe right into Germany. And so that's our fear, is an all-out attack on Germany and Western Europe. And that has been our fear since the end of World War II. And that would completely decimate and annihilate Western Europe. They're furious about it. They're angry about it. But folks, that's geography. You can't really move the earth like that. That's just a hard reality. And so what have we done in the last 80 years is protect Western Europe. President Trump said that NATO was obsolete and that NATO members weren't paying their share. And, NATO's not very important. I hope y'all can understand now why he said those things. Because Putin told him to. He's been doing Putin's bidding as far as foreign policy from the get-go. I'm curious how much domestic policy here in the United States was springing out of a conversation between Trump and Putin. During the January 6th attempted coup, phone records between President Trump and whomever he was talking to have the phone logs in the White House do not say who Trump talked to for 7 hours while that conflict was going on. The use of burner telephones and not being open and transparent about how he talked to people on a daily basis. And presidents know that there's record keeping. Presidents provide those records to the American people and to Congress because they have nothing to hide. They're not having 7-hour phone conversations with our enemy. Anytime that any American president talked to a foreign leader, there was a transcript of it released. Not under President Trump, who refused to release transcripts of conversations that he and Putin had, even as far back as Helsinki in the early few days of Trump's administration. And so who would Trump not want you to know he was talking to on January 6th when a group of people was trying to violently overthrow the government by encroaching and invading Congress and disgracing the halls of our government. So I'd like to see those phone records myself. I'd like to know who he was talking to and who he would want to hide that conversation from. It's a very serious uh, situation there. Congress continues to investigate the January 6th attempted coup. And I think Americans are having a very difficult time grasping the seriousness of this, because I don't think the Americans can imagine that the United States could come under the influence of a foreign leader, or that a foreign leader could have a puppet dictator here that got the heck out of his way whenever he wanted to, invade Eastern European country. But if anybody thought NATO was, not united, that anybody thought that NATO would not respond to this crisis, they misjudged the strength of NATO, and they misjudged Joe Biden. Biden was talking to NATO country leaders when he met at the Vatican with the Pope. There were meetings between Biden and uh, Macron and Boris Johnson and other leaders that ran down to Italy to quickly have a conversation with the new President Biden about what to do about NATO. And NATO is as strong as it was at the end of World War II. And NATO is really holding the line on this. They're very afraid of encroachment. They're afraid that Putin won't stop with Ukraine. I don't think he'll stop with Ukraine, but I don't think that he's foolish enough to invade a NATO country because he will be met with overwhelming force if that's the case. Questions about any of this? Comments about any of this? Y'all are gonna have bad dreams tonight, right? Because you because you listen to this. No, don't worry about it. Okay, there's nothing you can do about it. And so you have to do what Bruce Willis advises all of us to do and live it up. Live big. Don't live in fear. Somebody said, I'll be fine. I'll be fine too. Okay. Because, what do you do? All right. We'll see y'all Thursday. Have a good afternoon and think pleasant thoughts. Okay. We need to talk about when the next test will be because y'all just finished a test and we need to, the whole course could be just about nuclear conflict. This stuff is interesting. It's really fascinating. I want you guys to watch one of my favorite movies, 13 Days, and I can give you the link to the movie. That's the closest we've come to nuclear war, and you need to see how President Kennedy got us out of it. And he did a masterful job, and it's a beautiful movie. You need to see it. But let me say this about that. We need to figure out when to have the test, and we have one more. No, we're not having any extra credit. No, 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 no. Your tests are open book. How much easier could this get? So, what you need to think about is the last section on the courts and how long you think it'll take us to talk about that. Because I can give you the 1-day court session, or I could give you 2 weeks worth. So let's talk about this. Your final is strictly based on the courts. It's not a comprehensive final, but you got the courts and some civil rights and civil rights and civil liberties cases that we need to talk about. It's not that bad. It's just there's a lot going on. Also, this Friday, I was hoping that you guys would turn in all discussion, question, answers, responses, that sort of thing. I realize now that Friday's Good Friday, and I hadn't been thinking about that. So try to get that stuff in before Good Friday because I don't want to interfere with your families' get-togethers and stuff like that. So let's quit. And if you have email concern, yeah. So this Friday, oh no, we're not having a test yet. Don't worry about that. We're not having a test yet. There's still some stuff about the presidency that I want you to know about, some procedural stuff. And so let's think about that for the next week. not this week, but for the next week. And then we have to start talking about the courts. Okay. All right. So take care. Can you set a reminder about everything due? Yeah, I can do that. I'll post an announcement about it too and kind of see where we are. And your final, not comprehensive, and you have a few days. You have a few days to work on it, and so you don't. I think that the week of finals would. I'll let the test run for a week because y'all have other stuff, right? Um, yeah. So wait a minute. So yeah, you can just reply to each other, or you can reply to what I said. I think in the discussion question, I think I put something up, my view of it, which you don't have to agree with me at all. Don't ever think that. There's no right answer to any of this. Okay? There's no wrong answer with regard to the discussion question. Okay. All right. We'll see y'all later. Get out of here. Thanks so much. Talk to y'all later. Okay.
Question, Professor?